Welcome back to another edition of Parks Fermé with Ian Parks with his feet firmly on the ground in Canada for all things the Canadian Grand Prix. Montreal seems to be keeping him very, very sunshiny and bright indeed. Ian, I wonder, is it as pleasant as it looks out there, mate? How you doing?
It is very pleasant, I've got to say. I've got to say as well, feet not quite firmly on the ground, but to give fans an idea of where I am. Pontoon, the Olympic Rowing League. It takes you from one side here where the shuttle buses and the cars are all parked up for the teams and drivers, and takes you across the other way to the paddock complex you can see over that side. So it's a pontoon that wobbles a little bit as I'm talking to you. You see me bobbing up and down, folks, you'll know the reason why. Not quite as bad as floor hoisting on the circuit. Just get that one in before we start anything there.
Yeah, I was going to say, how's the back then with the up and down on the pontoon? Because it seems to be bad for everybody else in Formula One right now, that bouncing. I mean, that's the main thing we need to talk about here, Ian, is that the FIA has started to intervene, has initiated the litigious moves of a maximum amount of bouncing that the cars are going to be able to do over FP1 and FP2 and perhaps into FP3 as well, and cars may be disqualified from the remainder of the weekend if they don't meet the required limit of bouncing across the Circuit de Gilles Villeneuve. It's an interesting one to say the least, isn't it?
At least the FIA has recognised now that there is an issue. That's a good starting point. Obviously, coming out of Azerbaijan, numerous drivers, not just Lewis Hamilton, but numerous drivers complaining about back issues, pains, aches. Carlos Sainz has said today he's even been for some scans just to make sure his back is okay. So that gives you some idea of what he went through in Baku. Lewis Hamilton today been complaining about headaches he's been suffering. So again, it just gives you a bit of an understanding as to what these drivers are going through. Yes, we know that Red Bull are doing okay. Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, their cars relatively fine, but for the majority of the other teams coming out of Baku, there were a lot of issues. And as I say, finally, the FIA has now recognised that, and on the grounds of health and safety, they're looking into it. It's a very complicated system, however, that they are now trying to employ, and it's been met with quite mixed reviews from the teams and drivers so far. George Russell has turned around and described it as nothing more than a sticking plaster over the problems. It's certainly going to need a lot more looking into, but as I say, it's a step. How far it goes from here now is up to the FIA and up to the teams in terms of what they want to do, but at least the FIA, they're doing something.
Well, they only had a week to bring something in. Obviously, the small gap between Baku, where the problem was really obviously intense, particularly for drivers like Lewis Hamilton, and going into the Canadian Grand Prix this weekend. And not only that, but the FIA is in a very difficult position because we know there's the issue of porpoising, and then there's the issue of the stiff rigidity of this year's cars. And they don't want to necessarily change the car technical specifications that are allowed, because then there would be uproar at those that have been trying to get it right. So to almost have a limit on the amount of bouncing that the cars are allowed to do encourages teams then, or forces teams to raise their ride height, which I suppose is kind of the position that Mercedes were always in anyway, to try and get rid of the porpoising problem.
Lewis Hamilton has turned around and mentioned today that they've been raising the ride height continually throughout the course of the season. And that car now is at its maximum it can be raised because of the way the car is set up at the back. It can't go any higher, and still the car is porpoising. So again, it gives you a level of understanding as to what's going on. As I say, what the FIA is trying to implement is very, very difficult. We're talking here about gaining a level of understanding of the porpoising of each one of the cars across all 10 teams. And then they have to try and take a measurement with regard to that level of porpoising. And then they will try and, in discussion with the teams, try and work out what is the best level to set that measurement at. And if a team goes above that level, out of the first 2 practice sessions on Friday and into Saturday's practice 3, and then in practice 3, it is still beyond these required limits, then the FIA has it within its power to deem those cars and that team too dangerous to compete across the rest of the weekend. And that team would be banned, shall we say, disqualified from taking part in qualifying and the race. So can you imagine the uproar if that was Mercedes? Given the amount of money that we're talking about that team invests, not only in its own organization, but within the sport of Formula One as well. So, as I say, we started off by saying it's a step. Is it a step in the right direction? That's going to be very difficult to determine because, as I say, the FIA here has really set the parameters very high indeed, and that could be very difficult to police. And once they have introduced them, potentially very difficult to implement. There's a lot of work that's got to be done before this goes any further.
The other question, I suppose, is, or the other kind of way to look at this, which I'm sure teams like Red Bull will be looking at this and saying, is that, you know, if Mercedes, who have gone with, and I think the trouble for Mercedes is that they have gone with that very unique looking design that nobody else is really replicating in the same way, and they're having the biggest problem. So it's well within other teams' rights to say you've tried something different and it doesn't work, and when you've asked for things to be changed, they've created a criteria that you have to meet and you're still not meeting it. Mercedes is huge in the sport of Formula One, but they're kind of building a rod for their own back at this point slightly.
They have from the very start, as we know, with that concept of car. The first test, as we know, in Barcelona, they introduced a regular looking type of car, for want of a better phrase. And then they rolled out that disappearing side pod concept from Bahrain onwards. That's the one they decided to go with. And of course, they've been faced with the question throughout the entire course of this season so far, at what point do we decide that actually we can't do anything with this concept? We cannot get it right like a Red Bull. Even Ferrari, when you think that car, the SF75, is bouncing up and down, it has porpoising, yet it is, at the moment still, despite its recent issues, as we know, on track with its reliability, it is still in both championships. It is still a title contending car, which Mercedes doesn't have. So, as I say, we're talking about Ferrari cars there that have bouncing, that have porpoising, but they're still quick. Mercedes have this level of porpoising and bouncing, but they're just nowhere near as quick as Ferrari and Red Bull. So Toto Wolff has said on numerous occasions, because he's been asked the question on numerous occasions, well, potentially we might have to change things. Who knows when that will be? When do they give up? When do they turn around and say, we've tried everything, we can't do any more? To give you some idea, I don't know whether yourself, Ollie, and whether the viewers might have seen, in practice on Friday, first practice on Friday, Lewis Hamilton was running with a giant hole cut in the side of the floor, and George Russell was the normal floor. So again, they were trying something very different. We're just going to see what transpires, whether that was something that has worked for them. Who knows what might happen? It's down to Mercedes at this point to say, that's it, we can't go any further. We've got to go back to the route that we had in that first test in Barcelona and go back to a regular looking car. They won't give up for the most part. They will try absolutely everything, but this is it for them at the minute. They're on the cusp.
I think all of us that watched FP1 today we're just very happy to see that no gophers were killed during the first session out in Canada. That was the big talking point from quite a dry opening session of the Canadian Grand Prix weekend. Just quickly, Charles Leclerc, you mentioned the reliability problem that Ferrari have had. It seems like it's going to kick in this weekend in terms of the cost that that's going to have now on Charles Leclerc in terms of grid penalties. When are we expecting an announcement? Because it seems like it's just imminent.
No grid penalty for this weekend, that's for certain. Obviously, we saw in Azerbaijan, he had that blowout of the system that cost him, certainly at least you would have thought, second place, if not the potential win, given the way the strategies were playing out between Ferrari and Red Bull. So for this Grand Prix weekend, he's got a new engine. He's got a new MGUH. He's also got a new MGUK. That means the four main components, engine, K, H, and turbocharger, he is now maxed out, shall we say. He's used up three of every single one of those elements now. A fourth one, wherever that might be, grid penalties. Yuki Tsunoda has taken a fourth of his various elements for this Grand Prix this weekend. He's going to be at the back of the grid. So they are looming. So it really is, bearing in mind that Max has won 4 of the last 5 Grand Prix going into this weekend in Canada. He's on a roll. Everything now is looking like it is starting to favour Max Verstappen, because at some point, we don't know when, but certainly sometime very soon, those penalties are going to kick in for Charles, and he's going to have to be fighting his way from further back down the grid.
Ian, as always, thank you for the time on what are these, of course, very busy weekends for yourself and anybody who's out there for GP fans covering the action on track. Always appreciate the time and info you give us, and look forward to catching up with you later on in the weekend, mate.
Thanks, Ollie. Take care, fans. And remember to keep following on gpfans.com and our social channels at GPFans Global.